Hi, everybody. This is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Welcome to the show. Oh, my lighting. There, maybe that's better. Okay. Welcome to the show once again. This week is Econ Minis. It'll be a little bit different. Really just planning to cover 3 things instead of our usual like half a dozen. And strong theme this week, I think. Of talking about inflation and its practical impacts with a farmer from Australia. I'll mention that the show is supported by humble donations. Usually folks give $5 a month on Subscribestar, and your donations are greatly appreciated and used to improve the show. My wife was just saying, so when do you get to make money from the show? All you do is put it back into the show. Someday, honey, someday. Anyway, but we still have a few production values things to deal with first. Let's see. Wanted to mention that U.S. event is coming up end of next week. Last I heard, they got they sold all the rooms they had, and they went back to the venue and asked if they could get a few more because they had a wait list, I guess. And so they actually do have a few more rooms if you want to join. Charlemagne's going to be there. Recent guest Prudentialist, Ryan Turnipseed, of course, who's been our regular co-host all this last semester. I'll be there, planning to bring my wife, so you can meet Mrs. Radleb. You're just making somebody a mod in the chat. Okay. Lady of Shalott, of course, and many others. So if you get a chance, please join us. It's in the Nashville, Tennessee area. So I think that's show business for now. Oh, I guess one thing more to mention is that right before we go off to that event, Ryan's going to be able to drop in for an episode next week. So that'll be nice to have Ryan back for a week. And then I'll be spending the weekend with him at that event. So that'll be cool because I've never met him in person. I understand he's quite tall. We'll see if I'm intimidated. All right. Now let's bring on Marcus Furius Pertinax. Hello, sir.
Hello and good morning from the college, shall I say. I really appreciate the invite. Bradley, it was lovely to be on your show.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. Let me just ask.
And apologies for my slight delay, of course. I'm sorry to keep your audience waiting. The setup was a little bit complicated compared to what we do otherwise. So I was getting used to when you said, sorry about that.
Yes. Right. So you said the place to identify you as coming from, since I like to use some kind of geography for my guests, is the Central Australian Wheat Belt. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
That's where I was raised, yes, and grew up.
Yeah, they said I am hearing roboting and they are hearing a little roboting too. So I don't know if there's anything you can do about that. We can understand you, but if you
Okay.
if there's any, I don't know if you have something running that you can quit or I don't know what.
I'm just eliminating Discord.
Mad Merc would always tell me it's because the internet in Australia is owned by the state, so blame them. You know.
that would be very, very valid. But no, I've closed almost everything I can. I've closed Discord. I've closed my other stuff. So I've just got my browser open now.
Okay. But like the chat is saying, and what I'm hearing as well, a little odd sounding, but we can understand you. So let's proceed. Okay. So as usual, we're going to end with the advertised topic. That is, we're going to talk to Furius about being a farmer and sort of what some of the forces that are coming to hit him. Oh, I'm sorry. I should introduce you because I can't assume that everybody knows everybody, right? So tell me if I've got your origin story wrong, but in our YouTube circles, I would know you best as a frequent guest on Apostolic Majesty's channel. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that would sound right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Apostolic and I have been streaming together for almost a better part of a year now. Because actually, that's my academic background is in fact history.
Right.
So
Right.
that's how
Yeah.
I sort of wound up here.
Right. So your academic background, your hobby, whatever you want to call it, is history, but you don't make money with your history. You make money with farming, right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah. Farming is the family business has been so since my family arrived in Australia in the late 50s, and it's a bit of a family sort of legacy, you might say.
I'm sorry, you said the late 30s is when your family came to Australia?
Late 50s,
Late
following the
50s.
Second
Okay.
World War. Yeah.
Right. And as I don't think you make any secret that you let me give it a moment to clear up. Okay, that's looking better. Okay, can everybody hear me now? Okay, I think it's okay. All right. So like I said, we're going to end with talking to Furius about what he's facing as a farmer, and start with some other stories, current event stories. But the running theme this week is going to be inflation. The regular theme, unfortunately, but that's the reality we're in. So, going to our first story, which I'm probably not on. Oh, I am actually on the right story. Good. Okay, yeah, this is actually a Twitter thread. And let me try to get back into my good habits of sharing things with everybody. So here is the link for you all to follow along if you'd like. Okay, so I just want to go through this thread from a guy named Apex that I think Raging Mandrill, one of a faithful follower and supporter, had sent to me. And he talks about interest rate hikes and why people are scared of them in the corporate world, basically. I want to share what he says, and then our specialist in some of these areas, Black Horse, I went over this with him, and he gave some extra insight that I want to share. But that doesn't undermine what this guy's saying. It just helps us understand what to make of it. So Apex says the financial elites, the new masters of the universe, the ones who play God without permission, what scares them? Interest rate hikes. Yes, interest rate hikes. What are they? What do they do? Buckle in. It's time to learn something. Okay, so he's going to walk us through this. I think part of the reason I want to do this, I think he explains some things that personally I find confusing, and I feel to some degree like it's purposely confusing. I think he explains some of this quite well and help us to understand why the kind of the structure of the current the big companies and everything is set up such that they really do not want interest rate hikes. So he says, what do we mean by interest rate hike? Let's keep it simple. First, there's something called the federal funds rate. Obviously, he's focused on the US market here. This is the interest rate that banks charge when they loan money to one another. If this rate is low, loans are less expensive, lower interest payments. In our free market, and he laughs about that, the Fed cannot directly change this rate. Instead, it sets a target range and uses its ability to manipulate the money supply to attempt to move this rate into its target range. Okay? And it's very complicated, but he's going to avoid that. Thank you. So, why does so much of Wall Street fear interest rate hikes? When interest rates are low, interest payments are low, obviously. So piling on huge amounts of debt is far easier. Servicing the debt is cheap. That is paying off the debt, right? Debt is one of the two primary ways firms raise money. They can issue bonds. Investors buy them. Each bond represents a loan of cash to the company, and the company uses the money. Another way a company can raise money is to sell equity. That means they don't have any debt, but it also means they've given away ownership of their company. So that's a pretty big downside, right? So he says each of them have costs. The cost of debt is the interest payments they must make, and the cost of equity is giving up the future earnings potential of the the piece of the company that they sold off. Right now, today, the cost of debt is much, much, much less than the cost of equity because of the low interest rates, right? So, incentives have consequences, as economists like to say. What happened? Wall Street loaded up with tons of debt. So companies should use debt to invest for growth, but they did not do that. I've been hearing about this. I like following the company Apple for various reasons, and I remember them talking about stock buybacks. I'd actually listen to financial calls, where they're talking to Wall Street, basically explaining their earnings and what's going on and everything. And they would say, "Yeah, we're doing a lot of share buybacks," and I'm like, "What? Why are they doing so much of that?" Well, he explains it a little bit. So they use the debt, the cheap debt. They use the cheap debt to buy equity back from other shareholders. That is, they buy stock that has been outstanding, like Apple stock that's been out there and people have been buying. Apple itself borrows cheaply, buys the stock, right? And this pumps up the stock price. He notes in passing, maybe this has nothing to do with it, but he says conveniently the executives of these big companies are mostly paid in stock, right? So buy up the stock, increase the stock price. If you happen to be a holder of stock, that works out pretty nicely for you, right? Let's see. I might skip that bit about the private equity firms. Well, okay. So private equity companies engage in what we call dividend recapitalizations. What's a dividend recap? Basically, the owners of the company load the firm up on huge amounts of debt and then pay themselves a dividend, cash paid to shareholders of the firm, using the proceeds. So, you turn debt into cash in your pocket, right? It seems a little bit short-term oriented, you could say, right? Not thinking about the long-term health of the firm. But anyway, since everyone likes dividends, share prices go up, and the owners of the firm are able to make lots of money. This is one way private equity firms generate lots of money. So if interest rates go up, so he's laid all that out. Now, what happens if interest rates go up? If interest rates go up, it's harder to juice stock prices up further. But it's not just that prices can't go up as easily as they used to. Oh no, the true fear of interest rates going up is that stock prices will go down. Why is that? Two things: leverage and discount rates. If borrowing gets more expensive, companies and individuals spend less money, the economy slows down, which reduces revenues for firms and income for individuals, which makes it harder to pay off the debt, which means less investment and the economy slows further. Not good. So that's if borrowing gets more expensive. That means if interest rates go up. But the real kicker has to do with the actual valuation of companies and net present value. And then he goes through explaining net present value. Let's see, how much do we want to get into this? Okay, I guess gotta hit it to explain it. If you've ever done certain courses in college, you might have learned this. So I just started a company. I expect in 2022 I'll make $1 million. In 2023 I'll make $1.5 million. In 2024 I'll make $2 million. Every year from 2025 on till my retirement I'll make $2.5 million. Net present value asks, what is today's value of $2.5 million in 2025? Or how much money would I need to invest in a risk-free investment today to have $2.5 million in 2025? Well, that depends on the interest rate, right? If interest rate is very low, like say 0%, you would need all $2.5 million to have $2.5 million in 2025. But if the interest rate is 10%, your money grows. So you can have less than $2.5 million to end up with $2.5 million in the future, right? So an increase in interest rates means the net present value of money I expect to make in the future declines. So if a company's value is determined by the net present value of all the money they expect to make in the future and interest rates rise, interest rates rising makes companies less valuable. If I'm making more money on a risk-free investment, because interest rates rise and U.S. Treasury bonds are risk-free, the value of a risky investment becomes less attractive. Valuations drop, the market tumbles. And that's why Wall Street fears interest rate hikes. Debt becomes more expensive, consumers spend less, valuations drop. And with markets at all-time high valuations, productivity growth disturbingly low in the era of Silicon Valley innovation and cost of living rising. Well, okay, so couple things to pull out of this in discussing with Black Horse. Number one, understand that companies have put themselves in a situation where they basically are counting on the interest rate to stay low so that they can keep servicing their debt. Because what happens is they'll have some debt that is maturing, that they have to pay it off. And the way they pay it off, and this is the part that sounds like, anyway, it doesn't seem like the way that we as individuals would run our lives, But anyway, the way they service the debt is they borrow more and pay off the previous debt. So, debt comes due, they borrow again at whatever the interest rate is this moment, pay down that debt, and now they have this new debt that'll mature later, right? So they're rotating the debt. Well, that works fine as long as the interest rates are low, right? If the interest rates shoot up, then borrowing at the current rate to pay off the old debt at the low interest rate puts you in a pretty bad situation. So companies have backed themselves in with these stock buybacks and loading up on debt. They back themselves into a situation where they're pretty much relying on the interest rates to stay low. What's the connection to inflation? Well, low interest rate can be high inflation. So now let's turn to the next article from Mises.org, just from yesterday. The growing pile of public debt shows that inflation is here to stay. Oh, sorry, I forgot to make the other point here, and this article is going to make it as well. What Black Horse said is when the result of this, what we've been seeing and what he laid out in our recent series, is that the Fed is now in a position to almost prevent a bust, right? And so the implication that the Fed could just up the interest rate, it's kind of not true anymore. They're just not going to do it. They know it'll crash the economy. They have ways to not crash the economy because all of these things that they okay, give me a sec. I am just having connection problems or something. Oh, I know what to do. Okay, give me just a sec. I realized I didn't have the Primo connection that I was using. Okay, I think I should be back and more solid on my connection. I forgot to do something. I was on Wi-Fi and I should have been on my hard connection. Okay, so so now let's come around to the public situation. He starts off by just saying that there was not very much consumer price inflation for about a decade, despite, as we covered in the recent series with Black Horse, despite gigantic monetary and fiscal stimuli. CPI was quite low, right? And he says most central banks were taken by surprise that we did start seeing some price inflation. So, step one, they tried to dismiss it as transitory and caused by supply bottlenecks related to the pandemic. But then wages started rising strongly, and the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, admitted that factors pushing inflation upward will linger well into next year. Next year being the year we're in, I believe. So now he's saying that the Fed will take action to address the inflation problem, but this author here does not buy it because both the Federal Reserve Bank and the European Central Bank only take baby steps towards ending quantitative easing and raising interest rates. They're unwilling to risk a recession in order to tame inflation. And he says hiking interest rates will most likely burst the current stock market, which we just were discussing, the real estate market, which we're not covering today, and corporate debt bubbles, the stock market and the corporate debt bubbles, as we just saw, being highly connected to each other. So the Fed is well aware of this because this is what happened in 2019 when financial markets plunged after 4 interest rate rises in 2018. So let's switch to an interest rate chart. This is showing, well, what happened? Okay, there we go. This is showing the interest rate over the last almost 20 years. You can see it was fairly high leading up to the 2008 crisis. Then it dropped to like near zero levels for what, 6-7 years, something like that. But then the Fed was concerned about the effects of inflation, so they started to raise the interest rate, and that's what you see highlighted in yellow there, and that's what he's talking about in this article. They started to raise that interest rate and try to ease off and not have such a crazy expanded market from these artificially low interest rates, and let and try to address inflation, right? That all came to an end, of course, as we all know, 2 years ago, when the COVID thing came along and they decided to pump the economy back up because they were afraid everything would crash because of lockdowns and so forth, right? And so right at the end of the graph here, after 2020, we see that the interest rate is back down to near zero again, which means we face the potential of serious inflation again. We're starting to see bits of that over the past year, right? So as back to the article, then he says the Fed raised interest rates 4 times in 2018, and the financial markets plunged. And so instead of continuing the normalization of monetary policy, the Fed lost its nerve and reversed course. And so people don't really believe the Fed when it says it's going to, do something to address inflation, right? It's got a credibility problem at this point. He says another obstacle, and this is where we come to the public debt part of this. We were talking about, the private debt, corporate debt. Another obstacle is the large stock of public debt accumulated since the global financial crisis. And he says a worrying relaxation of public spending, even in previously frugal economies. I think he means an increase in public spending, right? Yeah. As we all know, the governments have been handing out money to everybody, sending checks, and so forth, trying to keep hold it all together through this crisis. So changes in the fiscal stance have been an important driver of consumer price index inflation in the U.S. during the past 70 years. When budget deficits have widened, annual inflation has pushed close to or above 5%, especially after the U.S. went off the gold standard in that magic year, 1971. Always have to mention our friends at WTF happened in 1971. Check out their site, and you see all kinds of things that were going along a certain way, and then it hit 1971, and they started going in a bad direction. So he says it's almost always the case that when fiscal slippages occur, central banks end up monetizing a larger amount of government debt. That is, when the governments start spending money hand over fist, the central banks try to take care of it, right? And so there's been a surge in public debt worldwide in the last 2 decades. For example, public debt burden soared from about 70% of GDP in 2001 to above 120% of GDP in 2021. Yet interest rates went down significantly due to the low interest rates we've been seeing, right? Anyway, and he goes into details. I'm not going to cover all this. A lot of debt, and he says, so how do we expect that the Fed or the European Central Bank is going to normalize interest rates when there's all this government debt? They'd be blowing up their own governments, in short. He says fiscal profligacy is spreading quicker than the pandemic. He says Italy and France, they've never been very good at fiscal discipline, but Australia, Korea, Germany, the Netherlands used to be known for their fiscal restraint. That's all gone. Since we've got an Australian guest, I guess I'll share this part. Through recurrent fiscal stimuli, Australia's public debt surged from a very low level of 10% of GDP before the recent crisis to 62% of GDP in 2021. So even the ones who were, careful to balance their budgets and all that have gone hog wild with spending and borrowing, right? And then he mentions a real estate bubble. So let's see, Korea also started spending money. And what else do we want to cover here? Okay. Germany, the Netherlands. Yeah. Okay, so same voice is asking for large growth stimuli in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, arguing again in pure Keynesian style that austerity is a road to failure, whereas public investment will boost growth and ultimately improve fiscal stability by reducing the debt to GDP ratios. According to them, Europe should not return to pre-pandemic fiscal rules, although these were hardly observed even then. The main argument is that there is massive deficit spending during the pandemic, and the United States better growth performance during the Great Recession. But together with Japan's lost decades, these are precisely very good examples that growth stimuli do not work. Anyway, right, he's saying, the economic recovery has not exactly been great, despite the government pumping all this money, or maybe because of. Okay, right, he's given various arguments for why people are arguing for continuing to keep the spending up, continuing to keep the interest rate low. But people are starting to realize that inflation is likely to increase further rather than fade away. It's fueling requests for higher wages, willingness to part more quickly with cash. Because remember, if you really get into trouble with this stuff, with the money not being something anyone trusts, you have what's called the flight into real goods, right? That means, why do I want to hold on to this paper dollar in my hands that I know is going to be worth less tomorrow, like noticeably less, when you're really start getting into hyperinflation territory. So I don't want cash. I want to, if I get cash, someone pays me in cash, I want to spend it quickly before it becomes less valuable. That's the flight into real goods, right? So people are wanting the higher wages to make up for the inflation, and they don't want to hold cash. And when lots of people don't want to hold cash, well, guess what? Cash becomes less and less valuable. Yeah, and so Thorsten Pollett, who often writes for Mises.org, says that the Fed may only want marginally higher inflation, like 4 to 6%, which matches what we saw them doing prior to 2019, right? Without letting it get out of control. But given the toxic interaction with already very high debt levels and rising inflation expectations, the central bank's plans could easily be derailed. Okay, so summarizing all that then, we've got government spending in not balancing the budget, right? Even governments that had in the past, like Australia's. I didn't know that. I didn't know that Australia had been fairly disciplined, but they've thrown that out the window, as have many other countries that used to be more disciplined fiscally. So governments are spending. Companies are and getting into more and more public debt. Companies are getting into more and more debt with corporate bonds. And all of it, the whole house of cards relies on a low interest rate. Problem, of course, being inflation. So that brings us to bring Furius into the conversation, who, as he mentioned, can you speak up, Furius? I want to make sure I can still hear you.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Sorry, I was just on mute. I was just on mute while you were going through that. So
that's
if you
fine.
can hear me, then yes, by all means, we can have a chat.
Okay, so as you said, your family has been in farming in Australia for a couple generations, maybe farming
60
before
years, yeah.
Australia.
2.5
Maybe before
generations.
Australia, you were farmer. Your family was farmers too, but at least in Australia,
Mm,
for all these decades, you've been in farming.
correct. Yeah.
And so I guess you don't just have your memory, your own experience, because I gather you're somewhat younger than me. You don't just have your own experience to go on. You've got
Only
a
slightly,
little,
red lib.
yeah. You've got a little bit of a family memory when you see
Yeah.
changes in the market, right? To go
Hmm.
on. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and so you can draw some parallels or lack of parallels in some cases to what you're experiencing
Mm.
recently. So first of all, we're going to go into talking about sort of the situation you're facing right now. And so a couple things to explain here. You, I think you're more at the sort of middle-sized family farm level, right? You're not the I guess there's farms that are operating at farming companies or whatever that operate at massive scale, right?
Yeah.
And so you can't really speak to that because that's kind of not the area of farming that you're in. You're in more the small to mid-sized farm level that you're going to be familiar with, right?
That'd be about right. Yeah, that's a pretty good classification.
Right. Okay. So just bracketing a little bit what you're bringing to the table there. Um, Having said that, things are looking a little bit different right this moment. And when would you say that started? I mean, I'm assuming the things we're going to talk about didn't start instantly when you first heard news about you first heard the term COVID-19 in late 2019 or early 2020 or whatever. You didn't instantly start facing the
A bank deposit guarantee, so people that had as much as up to $100,000 in cash in the bank would have their savings guaranteed by the government, which has its positive and negative aspects to it from a nationwide economic standpoint. But yeah, as the GFC, as we're sort of heading towards it, as it started unraveling, it was quite an intensity of energy prices. And I mean, you're older than me, you probably remember, oil got as high as $140, $150 a barrel. Now, when you've got an industry like agriculture, which is relatively energy intensive insofar that you're
Mhm.
running headers and combine harvesters, and you drive utility vehicles and trucks and what have you, and
Right.
also as a farmer, when you subcontract services into help, like for instance, a lot of farmers will hire people to bring in fertilizer. They'll hire truckers to bring in. Say, for example, if you seed a different variety of crop, you need someone to deliver the seed, for instance. Now, when those truckers, and Australia probably more so than America, is very, very reliant on what we call road trains, which are sort of multi-tailored trucks. And our economy would freeze up if our
Wait,
road
I'm
trains
sorry.
fell off.
That's a term I haven't heard before. Did you say road train?
Yeah, so a road train is a multi-trailered truck, right? You know, like what you'd call
Oh,
like a RIP
uh-huh.
in America. Yeah, like a road
Yeah, yeah,
transport
yeah.
truck. And these things can have as many as 2 or 3 sort of long trailers behind them, and our
Right.
economy almost runs on the back of them. And so
Yeah.
when those businesses are impacted by oil being at $140, $150 a barrel, and the pump price that follows from that, all those costs roll on it, and the farmer, as I can't remember who said this, if it was Reagan or JFK, but farmers buy everything at retail price and sell everything at wholesale price. Those are the ones who make the difference. And so, um, and what coincided with that was also a spike in glyphosate prices. Now you have a graph on that I've given you, which
Oh
is more
yeah.
relevant
Let
to.
me switch that. So first, you're going to have to explain what in the world glyphosate is. I've never. Oh, wait,
Sure.
not that one. This one. Okay, I've got it up now. What is glyphosate?
So glyphosate is basically the active ingredient in something that's called Roundup, and Roundup is a very ubiquitous
Uh,
um, herbicide that's used
yep.
in most broadacre farming. So, for farmers who grow wheat, barley, um, oats, etc., etc. And also, I know in America, because you guys have a lot of GMO soybeans, you have a lot of GMO corn. Basically, glyphosate is used, or Roundup is used to as like a mass scale herbicide against weeds. Right? And
Someone in the chat said Agent Orange.
Agent Orange is a very, very, very cheap equivalent of it. And what was made Agent Orange worse in Vietnam was the fact that, as you'd appreciate, Radley, when the government puts out tender, they always go for the lowest prices. And
Uh huh.
when you're in the realm of, inorganic chemistry and pesticides and whatever, the cheaper something is, the more it's bound to be with toxic impurities. And that's actually what the problem with Agent Orange was in Vietnam, was that not only was it a designed pesticide to destroy, the canopies of the rainforest, but it was laced with impurities. And that's why a lot of, American and Australian soldiers are sick. But that's an aside. That's just answer the question in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay.
But in this
So
graph,
it isn't crazy to bring up Agent Orange. It was basically meant to be for the
yes,
same purpose. It's just that Roundup,
yeah,
which is used in our agriculture, would be higher quality.
exactly, yes.
Got
Although
it. Got
I
it.
would
Okay.
contest that, because compared to even 15 or 20 years ago, so much more of our herbicides and pesticides come out of China, whereas once upon a time,
Mm,
a lot of it came out of Germany, a lot of it came out of a little bit came out of Britain. You guys there in the States used to make an awful lot of it. And I mean, I
yeah.
am of the more organic oriented person. That's just a personal choice. But
Hmm.
in the end, I'm also a person who cares about quality control. And if I was in a position where I was forced to use herbicides or pesticides, I would rather them be made in a country that actually has, rigorous laws of health and safety standards, and not, in China. But that's an aside. That's a separate point.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Allow me to cleave back to this graph. So this graph only goes
Yeah.
back to 2019. I couldn't find a more long-term graph, but you can see here from the middle of last year, when you might say when some countries started loosening up their initial lockdowns, what have you, that's
Hmm.
when the pinch started to be felt in terms of economic logistics. And from that point where it's about 2.8, 2.98, 2.97, 2.98, it basically begins a climb that never ceases.
Right.
And through the tail end of 2020 and going to 2021, and that's only till about, I think, by the looks of it, October last year, the
Right.
price of glyphosate's been going up. Now, going back to what I was saying about the GFC, there was a similar price rise like this about 15 years ago. And so if you combine high energy prices with a high price of glyphosate, which is ubiquitous, almost all modern farmers will use this. Um,
Hmm.
a farmer can't massively expand his income streams or increase the profitability of his business insofar to absorb these costs. So
Hmm.
with the GFC, we sort of had a bit of a taste of what this was like. Unfortunately, interest rates were still relatively low. In fact, as I'm sure you've spoken about this on your channel, one of the most realized economic levers that government made was actually dumping interest rates to sort of to create stimulus in the economy. Not only did the governments spend money, they also decreased interest rates at a very low rate to sort of try and incentivize investment, to incentivize
Right.
deficit spending, whatever. So that I did notice that when this happened, tending around the GFC time, and I'm noticing this again. There is, because of the logistic situation in Western economies, is energy prices have gone up. Even in this year, gasoline prices, or what we call petrol, but gasoline prices and diesel prices at the pump have nearly doubled in 18 months. You can see on this graph here, from when I was talking about mid last year to now, or what was October last year, the glyphosate's become more expensive again. And when you sort of add these input cost rises together, like I said, a farmer can't magically double the size of his flock. A farmer, unless
Hmm.
he leases a neighbor's property or he's able to access more land, can't just magically double his cropping area. And even then,
Hmm.
as a farmer always does, if you were to have a graph of the vertical integration, or the vertical production process of primary produce, it is the farmer who bears 99% of all production risk. Ultimately, if a grain seller can't get grain from Victoria, they'll get it from New South Wales. If they can't get it from the East Coast, they'll get it from the West Coast. If they can't get it from Australia writ large, they can get grain from Russia. They can get grain from Brazil. They can get grain from Argentina or the United States or wherever. Markets in these internationalized economy, there are always options. And then, of course, once a grain merchant has grain, they can sell it to millers, and millers buy from this merchant or that merchant. There's always options. But a farmer,
Hmm.
if they suffer a situation where they have a production failure, whether it's as a matter of drought or as a matter of poor season, medically, or there might be a disease onset. There's a number of diseases that can affect production, such as rust, or rust is a very good example. And by rust, it's not like metallic kind of rust. It's just the terminology used to describe a type of fungi that can grow on crops, which is usually coincides with high rainfall. All these things can happen. And ultimately, it's never the merchants who suffer the consequence, or the millers, or the end line product sellers. Whether people who bake loaves of bread, or pasta or whatever. The farmer will always bear that risk. And yet it's the farmer, like I say, buys everything at retail prices, sells.
I guess you have your own family experience. Well, you guys use it, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. My father, my uncles do use glyphosate, and I mean, insofar that, because I have stayed in streams that my family, my parents have literally just died in the last 18 months or so. So we actually didn't plant a crop last year. But from I think, from what my dad was saying, I think 66 might have been the first season where they used widespread sort of chemical usage, like in a production year, up until 2020. Yeah, we were using them, and I understand the technical merits of doing so. But this isn't the stream to get into like the health side of things. Otherwise, I'll go on a tangent, and I'm sure that's not what your channel's about. I'll respect the essence of what we're discussing today.
Right, and his other comment from Minoan is, without glyphosate, we wouldn't be able to feed the world's population. It was key in the farming revolution. So he thinks it's pretty critical. Anyway. That's sort of a side point, because whether they need to or not, you're saying pretty much all farming is going to use glyphosate, and the price of it is it's a very important input to farming, right?
Correct. Just if I can offer some quantifiability to this for you, when I left high school and I went back to the farm, and this is geared towards Australian dollars, so you could probably almost double it if you're speaking US money here. Our chemical budget would have been approximately $150,000 to $200,000 a year, like over a production season, right? Because often you'd pre-spray your pasture prior to seeding it or drilling into the ground, and then when the crop germinates, you would apply again. And then often there's a thing we call crop topping, which is if there's any late shoots of weeds that occur before the weeds, or this is true of barley, but before it throws up what they call a head. And if you look like the photo you've got of me, for instance, what you see in my sort of avatar there is a head of wheat, and that head is full of grains, full of seeds, and those seeds are sort of encased in husk. Now what you've got there's a picture of a mature crop that's ripe for harvesting. So that head sort of shoots up on the wheat plant, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months, so halfway along its growth cycle, which is about an 8-month cycle, a 6-month cycle, depending on your variety of wheat, because you have like fast growing and slow growing varieties, and it gets a bit technical. But at halfway through its growing life, it will throw up that head, and just when that head starts to come up, or just prior to it, is when you crop top. So in essence, most farmers will probably apply chemical to their crop 3 times over in a growing season. So it's a very significant part of from a technical aspect of growing a cereal, and it's also, as a result, quite the expense. And like I said, when I left first went back to the farm, you're talking a $150,000 to $200,000 budget. Now, when glyphosate trebles in 2 calendar years or 18 months, that budget blows out from around 200,000 to 500,000-600,000. Even if you trim back your usage on your application rates, you can't make up that difference by being stingy. Ultimately, because you're talking about chemistry here, you need a specific, or you need a certain amount of ratio of water and chemical for it to actually work. Otherwise, you're wasting your money even buying it. So the farmer only has so much wriggle room. But for a family farm that, like I said, has only got so much revenue, has only so much equity in their business, was able to, overdraft so much if they have to make up a deficit year, for instance. A 2 or 3-fold increase in glyphosate as a standalone, forgetting energy prices, forgetting labor costs, can impact
Yeah.
a family business quite considerably.
Right. Now, I always remember that, some people like me consume YouTube on the phone while I'm working out and stuff like that. So I just wanted to talk about the graph a little bit verbally, because probably the best some people are going to be able to see is just the
Just
curve,
before just
you
before you
know.
do, may I
So,
just make a quick
yeah.
point of something in the chat?
Okay. Go ahead.
Just a Fraser commented that Aussie farmers don't get state funding. Yes, Australian farmers are one of the few farmers around the world that essentially offered no state support. We have very little in the
Ah.
way of subsidy. The only subsidy we actually get is a small. What we have is a diesel rebate. So for all
Hmm.
operations on the farm, whether it's tractor usage or combine harvester usage or utility usage or trucks or whatever, we can actually claim tax back on that from the government if the usage is either on the farm or for farm purposes. And that is
Right.
quite literally the only assistance we receive from the government, and it's been the case, I don't know, for as long as I've been alive. So I mean, I'm in my mid-30s, so I'm assuming it goes back even further. And that is the only support that we get from the government is a diesel rebate.
Wow. Okay, that is interesting because I'm just used to. I don't know if you ever saw it, Furious, but if you haven't, you should really see H.L. Menken going off on farmers. But I think the context of that is important, right? Which is he's in the American context where there are constant series of, well, basically farmers being real big a political force in America.
Mm. Oh,
Subsidies and buybacks, and Minoan mentioned one. He said there's a program in the U.S. that will pay the farmer for letting land go back to nature. There's all kinds of stuff that
yeah.
the government tries to do to support the agriculture industry. And you're saying there's almost nothing in Australia, basically, for that sort of thing, right?
Correct. And two minor points just on what you've said. And I mean, I don't want to go into a tangent, but this is just a reflection to buttress what you've just said. Is that for any of your, I'm assuming most of you will probably be Americans, but whether it's yourself or anyone listening to this, go through it, go to a supermarket and go through shopping aisle, and you'll be surprised if you pick up any product that has been made in a factory. By that I mean, I'm obviously not talking about your fruit and vegetable aisle. I'm not talking about, if you have a carvery or something in your supermarket. It's obviously not what I'm alluding to. But any food made in like a factory, a manufactured food product, right? And if you look at the ingredients on it, you will find either some kind of seed oil, or you'll find the inclusion of high fructose corn syrup. And for instance,
Hmm.
high fructose corn syrup will be in ice cream, it will be in bread, it will often be in
Yeah,
dairy products, and it'll be fortified with this
we've noticed.
this high fructose corn syrup. Yeah, exactly. And one that's had terrible implications if you talk about like in terms of the public sector and the sheer cost burdens of health spending. I mean, again, that's another tangent, and let's go
Yeah,
there today. But just for the sake of the economic argument, what was an agricultural and economic policy has had a roll-on effect that may or may not have been unforeseen, but it exists nonetheless. And the second thing
hmm,
is that there creates essentially an artificial demand. Like from
hmm.
a neutral standpoint, there is no reason to have high fructose corn syrup in a loaf of bread, but they do it. A, because it is cheap, and there's this system whereby it supports corn farmers by generating this
Yeah,
demand for corn, thereby keeping the corn commodity price raised, which benefits farmers. So it's kind of a bit of
right.
market distortion, from like a from an Austrian school perspective of economics, you might say.
Yep, absolutely. So let me walk through this graph verbally real quick, just in case you
Sure.
can't see the axes very well. I'm just going to describe it. So we start the graph in about mid 2019 at about $3.50 US dollars per kilogram of glyphosate, which is this I guess key input into making Roundup. And a lot of people have heard of Roundup, I think, but a weed killer.
Yeah.
And then it actually it
Herbicides.
actually it actually drops or hovers around 3.5 until mid to late 2020, and then we start seeing the impacts of the crisis. don't don't have to specify exactly what, and we start to see it climb until it's up to $6 by say mid 2021, and then the graph ends with it at $8. So I tried to Google on my phone really fast to see what the current price was, and I wasn't able to find it. You don't know, do you? Furious?
Sorry, Bradley, repeat. What you say? What you asked me?
You don't know the current price of glyphosate like right this moment, do you?
No, no,
Okay.
sorry.
Anyway,
Like I said,
not
we,
sure
we
where it
stopped
is.
cropping. So the moment we stopped using it, I just didn't pay attention.
Yeah. So we're not sure where it is right now, but what we're looking at is at least a doubling in price, close to almost a tripling in price in a really short amount of time, right? I mean, basically over the course of 2021, we see this really dramatic price rise in about a year, right? Um, and yeah, and you're saying that this is uh, directly hitting the cost, a major cost aspect of, um, well, I don't know, crop farming
Yeah,
in general. Fair to
absolutely,
say?
absolutely.
Yeah,
And say, for instance, if we make a distinction between sort of commercial corporatized farming, which has become a massively expanding part of the market. I mean, that's true of the last 10 years, never mind of the last 20 or 30 years when it started to ramp up in that sense. If an equity firm or some kind of investment corporate body buys a number of farms and amalgamates them into a business and whatever, those companies usually have the liquidity and the cash flow and just the sheer invest power to be able to absorb this. Um, you know, Papa Joe farming in the Southern Appalachians, or Farmer Smith here on the outskirts of Adelaide, in South Australia, is less able to do that. Like a family farm will only have so much equity and so much cash flow and so
yeah,
much sort of meat on the bone. And this is
right.
where I have a gripe with the onset of corporatized farming, because I think sometimes there's too much emphasis on like the mass aspect of economics or of production and whatever, but without the without realizing the impact. And say, for example, when I first went on AA show last year, and I actually spoke about the socio-demographic impacts of this slow strangulation of the industry. um, we basically don't have rural communities anymore as a result, because more and more people are realizing that they just can't go through these cycles, such as pre-GFC, such as now, where there is such a sudden and rapid expansion of input prices that is beyond the control of the market. Or not to say that the market should control the prices, but the ability to absorb them is relatively limited. And
Hmm.
so farmers essentially cash in their chips and leave. And then most
Right.
most of that replacement, because where family farms sell, they will often sell to corporate bodies, and this problem just
Yeah.
exacerbates.
Right. So you get more consolidation in agriculture, um,
Mm. I've just got an article here just to answer your question, Radley.
large firms that end up becoming ever more political. I think. Right. The large
Yeah, of course,
firms
and they have yeah, and
end
they
up
carry so
spending their
much more
time.
sway. Like, say, for
Yeah,
example, in
they end
Congress,
up spending their
like,
time lobbying. Right. More
yeah,
time lobbying and less time farming.
absolutely. Just to answer your question about the present price, I got an article here from
Hmm.
the end of 2021, and um, where am I? Glyphosate, one retail location in Missouri told Farm Journal that glyphosate prices are up 100% this year, going from $19 per gallon to $38 per gallon. And glufosinate, which must be, I think, a substrate of glyphosate, is showing a
Hmm.
50% increase, now $70 per gallon compared to 45 last year. And that was
Right.
of November last year. So that's the most recent thing I've seen.
Right. Yeah, and I also saw a story, Furious, that said prices of glyphosate are up. This was late last year. Prices of glyphosate are up if you can even get it, because I assume part
Mm,
of the story here is the supply chain issues, not just contributing to the
mm,
price, but contributing to uncertainty, right?
mm.
And
Yeah.
I gather that that's a big problem when you're farming, because as you explained, the different points where you want to use Roundup, say in your the life cycle of your crops,
Mm,
if the supply chain isn't working at that moment when you need it, then
mm.
unless you're a big company that can afford to have a big stock just sitting there. I'm assuming a small family farm, small medium-sized family farm, doesn't have a barn full of Roundup, right? You go and buy it when you need to
Correct.
use it. Right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So if there's supply chain problems, that could be a big problem. It's time to do
Because
your your second or
I mean,
third
you're an
dusting
economics
or
man.
whatever,
You understand this.
and
In
you
the
can't get
end,
it.
you can't. So providing if you don't have the economic power, it's a difficult ask for a family company to just hold all this inventory because of price
Right.
uncertainty. Ultimately, people only have so much financial capacity to buy X amount of product or X amount of input because that is what is affordable without disrupting cash flow too much, as an example.
Yep. Right. Yeah. So you rely on sort of just in time providing through the supply chain of these things, and then we have these supply chain problems where things just aren't on the shelves, right? And then you've got a
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean,
are we
I
ready?
remember
Are
in
we
the
ready to bring the inflation into the story with the next graph?
Sure. Just one thing I quickly would like to
Okay.
mention on this, just to cap it off, is that I remember when I was on the farm, around like pre-GFC, and each time, say, one of my dad or one of my uncles would call our local sort of agricultural supplier, by the week, it would be the time delay for being able to access glyphosate Roundup it would blow out from 1 week to 2 weeks. And then the price increase correspondingly would go up, $10, $20, $50. And sort of as you have this contraction of supply, have the increase of price, not just through market falls, but also because every other person is trying to buy it as quickly as possible. You sort of get this sort of chase effect of as this supply contracts, of course, you have demand-driven forces of price increases, not from even the production end or from the broad economic end, but just from the people in that market trying to buy this product at the same time. It becomes fever pitch almost.
Right. And back to the consolidation point, real quick. Just wanted to mention that academic agent has talked about this a bit. That there does seem to be some evidence, which we all kind of expected, right? And I feel like we've seen it around us, that some of the small family firms have been around forever, couldn't make it through lockdowns and through the various impacts of the measures that were taken, at least in regards to the COVID period. But we can't help but notice that the Amazons and the Googles of the world have done quite well through all this. I don't think it's just big tech, though, right? I think what Furius is telling us is that in agriculture, where most of us wouldn't know the big names of the big agricultural firms, right? But these agricultural firms were able to make it through these supply chain uncertainties and price rises on glyphosate and so forth. They were able to get through it and then basically end up buying out the small time farmers, right? So the ultimate effect would be yet another industry where we see some consolidation as a result of the government measures of the last 2 years. I mean, that's kind of your impression, Furious, right, of what's been going on, right?
Exactly. And from a personal standpoint, and this is from a non-corporatized standpoint, if we're speaking solely on consolidation, the area where my family farm, for instance, when in the decade leading up to my birth, there would have been perhaps a dozen families farming in our specific region, anywhere from say 14 to 12, depending what calculus you did. That same amount of area in 2020 was farmed by 4 families. So if you consider like the acreage concentration that has occurred in a relatively short space of time, because if you're talking long-term trends, 20 years is a relatively short space of time. There's been a dramatic amount of capitalization and consolidation occurring in a relatively short space of time in that respect.
Right. Okay, we have updated prices from a friend of the show, but it'll take me a minute to pull them up. So why don't we continue? I'll come back to that.
Sure.
Oh, wait. Discord launched. I think I might be able to get to it. Oh, come on. There we go. There we go. Okay, yeah. So he's showing. Oh wow. Okay, so same graph. I don't know if I'm going to be able to easily get it on screen. Maybe I can. Give me just a moment here, just to finish out this story. Up to current, and wow, it's worth seeing, Furious, especially since you haven't been um, keeping an eye on it. When I realize I show it to you. Okay, wait, what? That's not it. What happened? Sorry, I thought I... Okay, sorry. I thought I'd be able to pull it up really, really fast on the fly, and I'm not succeeding for some reason. Give me one more sec to try here. Where is it? No. Okay. Okay. Anyway, I'll just have to tell you verbally. So thanks, Mickey, friend of the show here. So yeah, you left off right before it really got exciting. The graph you pulled up. So it ends at about $8. The graph we have had on screen in August or September, and then it really leaps up starting in October, and this ends on Christmas 2021 at $13.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
we're talking what are we? Let's see, 3 times 4 would be 12. We're talking about a 400% plus. Yeah, or something around
price, essentially. Yeah.
Something around 400% price increase. So my
Yeah.
goodness. Okay.
For instance, this year, I know for certain that I'm pretty sure South Australia had a record production year, and I'm pretty certain that Western Australia had a big production year, which compared to the eastern states, they export more because they just have less of a population, ergo less demand for grains. Therefore, those two states do export more to international markets, as well as they even send their grain to the East Coast as a result, because the cities are on the East Coast, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, etc. Right? And even though it was a very good production year, for example, in terms of yields, because of these cost increase that have been brought on by, shall I say, circumstances derivative of the coup, their profitability wasn't much better. Right. In fact, in some instances, profitability wasn't any at all. Yeah, okay, I can see that graph. Wow, holy moly.
Yeah, now you're seeing it.
Yeah. And so, and that's basically kind of what I've heard. I didn't realize the scale was that dramatic, but I did hear as much that that despite the very good production year that people had, because my family we still have livestock, and in this next, like, because my parents have retired, I will be running stock with my father. That's the plan. But I wasn't quite aware of this, but I had heard friends of mine, or even friends of my father's, who had put in a crop this year and grown wheat and barley and canola, etc. They said as much, and I'm not surprised to see it, to be honest with you.
Okay, now that everybody can see the graph, let me just again verbally help you. So we had already shown that starting early 2021, it started to rise, but then just less than a half year ago, it really goes crazy, really goes bonkers, and nearly doubles again. Doubles, and then it doubled to late or fall 2021, and then it's like doubled again by the winter. So wow. Thanks Mickey for that. That is insane. Okay, so that's the input price. Like you said, you could have a great bumper crop year. You're saying that some people did, and the benefits of that were wiped out by increased costs, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay,
yeah,
so
exactly right.
Are we ready for the next picture?
If you'd imagine, for example, if there'd been a crop failure, for instance, a farmer would have worn the entirety of that price rise and would have found themselves in a deeper deficit. And that does actually happen to farmers sometimes. Maybe not under such dramatic economic circumstances as this, but that does happen.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of risk in farming, right?
Absolutely. They're the
Okay.
ultimate
So then,
gamblers, except they don't pick where they put it on red or black, essentially.
right. Right. Okay. So do you want to see wheat prices now?
Yeah, sure, let's do it.
Okay, so now this is a long-term chart that you found for us. They called it a 40-year chart, but this seems to be covering more like 60 years to me. It starts in 1960. So we see high wheat prices in that crisis period of 2008, right? We see a big peak and kind of stays up a bit, but then it drops more recently. Say there's a bottom point around 2016. And then as we go towards current, now it's rising up. The wheat prices are rising up again. Well, that's great, right? Because people are paying more money for wheat. What's the problem?
That's right. Yeah, and if there's dual effect of the increase in input prices, and then you combine that with inflation and the reduction of purchasing power of the dollar, I mean, you'd rather the wheat price goes up than down as a producer, obviously, because it makes up some of the difference. Right. But your actual profitability is completely eviscerated by all the other factors that we've been talking about the last sort of half hour or so.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah, and I mean, if you want to get into the nuts and bolts of production, I actually, like I said, I do have some notes of what I've discussed this a couple of months back with Mr. Patriarch. But let's probably speak more about the graph, and then if you want to, I can get into some more detailed analysis.
Okay, yeah, we can do a bit of that. So yeah, what do you want us to get out of the wheat price graph here?
So, for instance, and I mentioned this in my stream with Mr. Patriarch, is sort of where the farmers who survived into the new millennia, into the 2000s onwards, are the farmers that survived. You can see between the 60s and 70s, you got almost a mini sort of recession there. If you look at I mean, especially taking into account what the value of money was back in the day, but growing wheat at $2 a ton, at $2 here is very unprofitable. I actually don't know if that graph is fair, but what the point I make is growing at, because I remember my father saying that essentially when prior to that big price hike, which you see at the early part of the decade of the 70s, wheat was commodity prices were around about $35, $40. And it was almost unprofitable for farmers. And a lot of farmers cashed out, and there are some farmers who even walked off their land, as in the bank essentially purchased the homestead, and they just walked off with enough money to relocate to the city. It was quite a dire situation that, I mean, I'm assuming this is probably true in other places, but certainly in Australia. But then what you see here with this price rise, and I'm talking in Australian dollars, in 1973 alone, within the calendar year, wheat went from $40 to $135. So you got to think, inflation can barely take effect in such a short space of time. So, and also think in 73, this is in the context of the OPEC crisis, right? So you've got an increase to some degree of energy costs,
right?
But that is over a trebling of your commodity price in a single growing season. That is dramatic.
Wow. Oh, just wanted to mention a couple comments real quick. Johnny Appleseed says, "Great grain robbery, 1972." I guess he's talking about the price going bonkers. That's that. If you're looking at the graph, early on in the graph, it's low and then it shoots up. That period is basically, sorry, trying to get to the page itself. Okay. That shooting up starts mid 72 and hits a peak in early 74. So that's throughout 72, 73, wheat price just goes way up suddenly. And then another comment he says, and this does seem to be correct, he says, bear in mind that this wheat graph is in dollars per bushel. So you have to multiply by bushels per acre which has improved a lot.
Yes.
So he's saying that there has been some improvement in farming techniques since the 60s. And so this doesn't tell the whole story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For instance, I've actually got some imports first profit stats here. If you like me to quickly run through them. So
Okay.
land utilization has from say price rise in the 70s till now, productivity and land utilization has increased from about 50% to 70%, right? And this is to do with chemical application, direct seeding as opposed to consistent tilling and ploughing, a much greater utilization of available rainfall, improvements in like the creation of varieties, because a lot of, for those who don't know, wheat would just seem to be what it is. Wheat is wheat and barley is barley. But what actually happens is there's a lot of breeding. If you just take GMO aside for a second, there's actually a lot of barley or canola, a lot of benefits in terms of yield, in terms of crop resilience, all increased productivity utilization as well. And also too, crop cycles have changed. I don't know how many of your viewers might know this, but the reason why, pardon me a moment, the reason why a lot of farmers who engage in cropping crop multiple types of plants is because if you're a farmer that grows cereals, you could wheat and barley and canola, those crops take from the nitrogen from the soil. That's their primary source of nourishment. It's what sort of you might say allows them to convert their photosynthesis. But if you grow a legume, so you're talking peas, you're talking lupins, etc., they actually do the opposite. They actually put nitrogen in the ground as well for their photosynthesis, because they're a completely different type of plant. So often farms will rotate. They can actually grow roughly 3 cereals. So in a 5-year cycle, approximately, it depends on your soil type, depends on your rainfall. There's a whole bunch of factors to consider. But by and large, a farmer could grow 3 to 4 cereal crops in the same time that they would grow a legume, and then leaving a paddock pasture for 1 season. So in 6 years, you can basically grow 3 to 4 of those years in cereals, which are your higher profitability crops, as an example. But if I may just do a quick comparison, so in and I'm sure you'll love this because I know you love economic specifics. In 1970, labor was approximately $1.50 per hour, fertilizer was $20 a ton, and fuel was $2 a barrel. In 2020, labor has gone up from $1.50 in 1970 to $35 to $40 an hour of labor, and fertilizer, rather than being $20 a ton, is $800 a ton, and fuel, having gone from $2 a barrel into 2020, was $65 a barrel. Now, that is more than a 20-fold. That is a 20 to 25-fold increase in input costs, and that was only from 2020. These are when I did the notes for Mr. Patriarch. That's not really included the last year.
I guess the thing you always have to ask is that inflation adjusted, right? Because everything went up to some degree just from inflation, right? General price inflation. Yeah. So we'd have to know if those were inflation adjusted, inflation adjusted dollars.
But comparatively, in 1972, the wheat price, as we saw in that graph, well, not that graph, well, the trends indicating that graph, but in terms of actual monetary context, wheat was $40 a ton at the start of 1972. Wheat, when I did this comparison here, as of the previous production year, so the 2020 harvest leading into 2021, wheat was $350 a ton, which is a 9-fold increase. So both the wheat price and, well, how can I say this? The input costs and the eventual profitability of the primary produce of the commodity are both subject to the same inflation. The difference is one's gone up 9-fold and one's gone up 25-fold.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, that's the thing to compare. Yeah. That sounds a useful way to look at it. Yeah. Right. So Okay, now one person in the chat said this kind of caught my attention. They got talking about how, in contrast to Australia, as we know, the European Union is is known for its agricultural subsidies, right?
Mm.
um,
Yeah, and
and
particularly
that
countries such as France and Germany, as an example. Yes, very much so.
yeah, and I think somebody was saying that this is something that Australians are not very happy about because they're,
Mm.
the Australian farmer who's not getting propped up by the Australian state is up against the European farmer who is getting all kinds of deals, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and I mean that could lead to a tangent, but just for the sake of the fact that you raised it, I'll say this much: it is a point of difference between, say, like my own father and myself, is that I agree with my dad's point of view that Arsenal being subsidized has led us to become some of the most astonishingly efficient farmers on the planet. We have had to
mm,
develop such ingenuity and such efficiency, which is almost unheard of because a great deal of Australia is very marginal country climatically in terms of rainfall and water availability. I mean, you look at large portions of, say, Western Australia and even South Australia, we have underground water available, but much of it is saline because, Australia is an
mm,
old and relatively geologically stable continent. But
yeah,
so that's a point to consider. And yet, despite the challenges that we face, we are very efficient in terms of raw production numbers. But then the fact of the matter is that you have these farmers who have much richer fertile soils, have a much stronger demand in terms of, France has a population that's almost treble Australia's. Germany has a population that's nearly quadruple Australia's. Um, Maybe not quite quadruple, but at least two and a half, three times over in terms of France and Germany, right? Italy is a nation of 70 odd million people or 65 million people. When you have that kind of a population, you have a lot of domestic demand for agricultural produce. In a nation of 25 million, it's a very different dynamic. And then the problem is then you're reliant on international markets and export, which adds a whole variability because you've got exchange rates and you've got, as we've experiencing now, logistical factors to consider with global trade and what have you. It complicates things rather more. And what really happened is that Australia has had to compete with the German farmer, the French farmer, the American farmer, with essentially a hand tied behind their back because, in the good years, yes, we can be profitable, but then in bad years, rather than having the subsidies, you might say, make the difference or absorb the worst of those losses, the farmer has copped everything, with the exception of that tiny diesel rebate that they get from the government.
hmm
We have
right,
to absorb these losses. And like we were sort of saying at the start of the show, or, when we start talking, family farmers only have X amount of cash on hand. They can only generate so much cash flow. They can only utilize so much labor. They can only tap out of so much equity of their farm before. Yeah, I mean, really, in Australia, you probably don't want to dip below 70% equity because once you sort of go below that, your ability to absorb more deficit spending very much diminishes. And then below 50%, the bank starts to look at you with an eyebrow raised because it starts to think,
right,
this farmer's not managing his finances that well. And if you
hmm
keep suffering losses with failed production or bad conditions, which aren't necessarily the farmer's fault, then you become prey to the banking industry.
right. So the comment I wanted to get to is Fraser says farming in the rest of the Anglo world would really struggle to be profitable without state funding. So I guess what he might be saying there is by the rest of the Anglo world, he means except for Australia, which is already functioning effectively without state funding. He's wondering if we put European farmers on the same footing that Australian farmers are, how long would they last? I guess is what he's wondering.
That'd be a very good question to ask Papa Furius. But yes, no, that's
Yeah,
quite right.
yeah,
And that's sort of that goes to the point of what I was saying about it's the conditions and being subjected to sheer forces of necessity that have made the Australian farmer as good as he is. But you can only be so efficient with your own means. You can only be so effective and resilient on your own means, and you're competing with people who just have an asymmetrical financial and economic advantage.
Right, right. Um, okay, so let's see. Okay, so we're done looking at the wheat graph, right?
Um, more or less, yes.
Well, I'm just trying to decide if I go off of it.
Let me just have a quick look at my notes. I just want to have a little look through
Okay.
my notes. Oh, actually, one thing that's worth mentioning is because I do love listening to these kind of economic things, and you talk about like Austrian school economics and Mises and what have you, is that as a result of the Second World War, Australia created what we call the single desk. So we essentially had a single nationalized agency that determined the sale of Australian grain beyond our shores in terms of international trade. And this was done
Really?
under the guise of, yeah, so this is done under the guise of what they call the AWB, which is the Australian Wheat Board. Um, and
So
what made it even worse,
wait. Let me make sure. Let me make sure I'm getting you. You're saying this
sure.
is blowing my mind because I don't think there is anything like this, like in the U.S. So you're
Hmm.
saying that okay, for domestic use, it's closer to just a free market, I guess, right?
Essentially, right.
Australian farmers grow with pretty much subsidy free, and Australian
Hmm.
other companies, buy it directly from
Hmm.
there at market prices, right? Okay, but
Correct.
you're
Yeah.
saying that.
And like
Go
intervention
ahead.
free by and large, yes.
Right, right. Okay, so within the Australian domestic market, it's pretty much free market.
Yeah.
But then you're saying once you're going to export some of those cereals or grains,
Hmm.
then that export price is going to be set by fiat by the state.
Yeah.
Wow, how
Mm.
has that
You
gone?
wouldn't have assumed that, right? Well, so that was done as a measure to control, because as one might understand, if you're talking like in a sort of a grand, and this is where someone like Prudentialist would be really good to wax and wane with, but in the context of interdiction and geopolitics and the war, because this was brought on because of the war, and you had convoy raiding by the Japanese and to a lesser extent the Germans and whatever, there was necessity to sort of during the war years concentrate um, that authority to the government more or less in terms of what we did with our grain, because it sort of goes back to World War One. Of let's just say the British were very dependent on the colonies in the First World War, and much of the British of the many of the British colonies didn't want to endure the same thing in the Second World War because they'd experienced in the First World War. So there was this, and also with the British, in the height of 1940, 41, the Battle of Britain, whatever, Britain was at the point of almost being starved out by the Germans. So the Australians, with the Japanese just north of us, didn't want to experience the same thing. So this is where the idea of the single desk came in. But what made it even worse is if you look at this period here, just the start of this graph from the 60s and 70s, what happened in Australia is that not only did we have the single desk that controlled exports, we actually had quotas. We had quotas from the mid 60s, from the early 60s until the early 70s. It was about a 10-year period where we had production quotas, which I'm
I'm sorry,
sure.
production quotas for export or just general production
No,
quotas?
no, no. On top of the controlled single desk exporting framework, we also have production quotas for grain production overall.
Overall, not domestic
Yes,
or exported.
yes, yeah. So you
Really?
have these two things
What?
coexisting. Yeah, and, and this is like a major bugbear of say like my father's, and I understand because he lived through it. And this is what drove a lot of like I said, with a lot of those farmers' aggressive price increase that you see here at the start of the 70s. That's what drove a lot of farmers off their land because, not only was the wheat price stagnant and it was barely profitable as it was, it had state
Mm-hmm.
intervention, um, essentially distorting the ability of farmers to be able to produce to the maximal of their potential. So a lot of
Okay, so
farmers
wait
just
a
gave up
second.
on
So, first of all, you're saying a phrase that I'm just not quite catching. Are you saying single desk, like a desktop?
it. Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes,
got it.
yeah.
So that single
This is the
desk,
phrase
meaning
we
that
use. Yeah,
meaning one price is being set for all exported wheat or whatever, right?
yeah. So the single desk is
Okay,
a reference to the Australian Wheat Board. It's an entity that controlled the export of wheat leaving Australia, and AWB would negotiate with external entities. So, for instance, what there was actually controversy, and what actually collapsed the single desk is that the chairman of the the last chairman of the chairmans of the AWB was a man by the name of Trevor Flugie, and he was actually caught in a scandal whereby he was shall I say, indulging himself with Iraqi elites prior to the downfall of Saddam Hussein.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like him, like literally shooting Kalashnikovs in the desert and like walking around like some elaborate palatial compound in underpants and drinking booze or whatever. Like, it was really kind of a funny thing, but that brought the single desk down. But what they would do is they would go to countries like, for instance, when actually someone in the comments here talked about the Soviets importing wheat in the Brezhnev years, because Soviets had major production issues during the latter part of the through most of their history, but certainly in the Brezhnev years, and it was AWB who would negotiate on behalf of Australian farmers to export as a single collective entity to the Soviet Union. But what happened is that the quotas were revoked in '73, which coincides with the price spike.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask. That 72, 73, where the price jumps up, you're saying that's where they ended. Okay, not the export price control, but the quotas ended at that point. Is that right?
Exactly. White farmers,
Got
farmers who had survived that period of tumult, survived that struggle, were able to expand relatively rapidly because, you know, on the profits of that first crop where price went from $40 or $35 to $135 and $140, were able to overnight double and treble the size of their properties.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. So yeah. Okay.
There's an old saying. There's an old saying from that time period too, Rodley, but I'm sure you'll appreciate it. Brezhnev once commented to the foreign press that we plant the wheat in Russia and we harvest it in Canada.
Wait, what does he mean by that? Planted in Russia and harvest in Canada. What?
So the Russian or the Soviet you might say state-controlled industry that would, you know, with these collectivized farms, organize the farming like labor forces to plant wheat, right? You know, throughout the Ukraine, through the Donbass, through southern Russia, through the Caspian and Caucasus regions, right?
Right.
They would plant it, and they would have such high loss rates because, you know, I'm sure you've probably touched this in some of your videos. You know, like just that Soviet communistic economic framework is difficult because, you know, it's sort of like supply driven rather than demand driven, and that sort of has its own problems where, you know, the people involved in the industry aren't driven to efficiency. They're not driven to improve methodology and whatever, right? You know, there's a whole bunch of factors that retard ultimate production, right? But just through sort of a bit of laxity and a bit of incompetence, because in the end, let's face it, the Russians or the Soviets killed all their farmers when they won the Civil War, so they basically had to shoot from ground up, right? And this still had an impact 1 or 2 generations following, right? Because they had literally destroyed all of their farming knowledge that is conducive of their areas. Because, you know, in the end, my family who are in Italy have been farming there for half a millennia. They understand the weather pattern, they understand the soil, they understand the topography. You know, that knowledge doesn't just materialize out of the ether. You know, it takes time to build that knowledge. So,
right. And that if you haven't done any farming, it might be a little bit hard to understand that. What you're saying here. And by the way, I should mention, Furious, my own extremely limited exposure to this, which is that 5 years ago we chose to move to a property with land. Now, there isn't that much land. It's 4.5 acres, and we're looking to acquire 40 more acres. But it's allowed us to it's allowed us to do a little bit of like hobby farming, right? We have chickens and ducks, and we have a large vegetable garden and so forth. And my wife is an avid gardener, and she's descended from avid gardeners. So I get a little tiny taste of what you're talking about, which is that it is not at all obvious how to have a successful garden or harvest, right? You think it is. You just throw some seeds in the ground and you're done, right? Well, there's weeding, there's dealing with weeds, there's dealing with various bugs and stuff that will attack your plants. Right, and on and on and on. There's actually quite a bit that you have to get right to have a successful crop, and that's the kind of
Yeah.
thing that you're saying that can easily get wiped out when, say, you send a bunch of your farmers to the concentration camps in the Soviet Union,
Exactly. Or shoot them, on the banks of the
or
Volga,
shoot
and
them. Right.
exactly.
Oh, so
That that
point of
quote
order,
about Brezhnev-
point of order,
sorry.
real quick. I should probably be wrapped up in 5 to 10 minutes. So think about what you'd
Okay.
like to cover from
Yeah, sure.
in a condensed way from what you covered with
Yeah,
Prudentialist. But go ahead.
yeah, sure. So, yeah, just to finish off that quote there. So basically, the Soviet authorities and the Soviet, you know, th- those involved in the communist agricultural sector would plant their crops in these areas, which are, wonderfully productive soils.
Yeah.
And I mean, Russia has gone from being, with the onset of, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and, the rise of Yeltsin, and then followed from Yeltsin to Putin, Russia has gone from being an importer of wheat to being the world's largest single exporter of grain. So keep that in mind. Ever since the liberalization of their economy from that supply-driven, collectivized agriculture to, something more resembling laissez-faire, Russia has become the world leader in wheat exports. So keep that in mind. But yeah, so the Soviets would plant their crops in, the northern hemisphere winter, but then there'd be so much widespread failure of the actual Soviet harvest that quite literally the Soviet authorities would have to call the Canadian government and buy grain off them. Hence the Brezhnev quote about the harvest was in Canada, because the Soviets would plant it, but they would harvest stuff all of it.
Right. Okay. So what did you want to share briefly from some of the larger context that I guess you spelled out? Oh, and in fact, I should actually, while you talk, I will find that because you sent it to me, I think, and I will share that link where you talked for about an hour with Prudentialist on. Well, so, what did you
Oh, no,
what did
that
you
was
cover
Mr.
with
That was
Prudentialist?
Mr. Patriarch. Sorry,
Oh, I'm
rather.
sorry, with Mr. Patriarch. Sorry, we have too many
Yeah,
friends that start
we
with
do.
P.
Far too many
But
friends.
anyway, yeah. So yeah, what would be if they went to that stream? What would they learn about in that?
Well, I've actually probably more what we talked about, say the price variation and that circumstance around the single desk and the quota years. And I mean, I speak from a slightly more of a personal standpoint as well. I just had a more detailed conversation with Mr. Patriarch about that. And that video is actually titled "The Enemies of Farming." So I've actually sort of alluded to some of the more predatory aspects of how things have panned out in Australia regarding the farming industry at large. Because that was on the back of the video I did with AA, where we basically spoke about the evisceration of Australian agriculture and its domination by foreign interest, and the fact that a lot of international corporate interests have flooded into the country and purchased some of our best farmland, to the extent where some of these companies are building parallel infrastructure so that they are more independent from the whims of the government and can almost act autonomously. It's quite a frightening thing when you think about it.
Hmm. As we wrap up, I thought it wouldn't hurt to just mention, we were not going to rabbit hole on this particular stream, but it wouldn't hurt to mention that you do have this interest, which is it seems like a fitting thing for a farmer to be interested in, but you do have an interest in what do we want to call it? More natural nutrition, maybe something like that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So if people
Yeah.
follow
Well,
you on Twitter, famously
yes.
they talk about you being really down on seed oils, which I guess the
Yes.
problem is, well, not necessarily with seed oils, but seed oils as we consume them are, I guess,
Yes.
highly processed and not very good
Yes.
for you, right?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I've been around the propaganda where, for instance, you could throw up. I don't know if you feel like it, but you could throw up a picture of the food pyramid, right? Which was a product of the American Heart Foundation and the work of Ansel Keys, who basically created the heart-diet hypothesis. and you have this demonization of natural fats, which humans have been consuming for thousands and thousands of years, and in concert with the big ag, big pharma. When I say pharma, as in like pharmaceutical industry, and sort of unholy
Yep.
trifecta of that with the medical industry writ large, with doctors and so-called health credentialed health experts, and it plays into the terrible health outcomes that have been apparent, well, primarily and most obviously in the United States of America, but also in much of the
Right.
Western world, probably to some degree with a slight aberration in continental Europe, because continental Europeans are Latin and stubborn, and they have their own set regarding this. The French and the Italians sort of eat a specific way. But definitely true, say, in the Anglosphere with Britain, Australia, whatever. And I mentioned that, I touched on that a little bit when we spoke about the high fructose corn syrup. And for those of us interested in economics, we should actually consider it, because look at the cost of health burdens, whether it's the British NHS or whether it's even in America. The cost of the expansion of the welfare state solely on the basis of the topic of health is huge. It has become such a monumental burden for the public sector, for government. And if you're a taxpayer, you should care, because ultimately it impacts you, and these are where the tax dollars are going to. And ultimately, we are becoming a fatter and sicker society. And as a person who, A, was a farmer, B, was a chef, and has had my own journey in this regard, I've really seen it from all angles. And, I remember reading things of my dad's, he'd get like newsletters and whatever, and it would spruik these so-called benefits. But a bit like, Camel cigarettes, doctor's favorite smokes, America, it's the vested interest starts to become apparent, and one has to see through the willful and intentional propaganda that's driven by agenda, driven by profiteering. It's driven by market distortion, very much in the American case, by lobbying, in the Beltway, in Washington, D.C.,
Yeah, I remember the thing that was this had not been a particularly hot issue for me. I'm not sure it is, but I find what you're saying extremely plausible, shall we say, because for many reasons. But one of them is I remember seeing some footage from the U.S. Senate where they're talking about the food pyramid, and some doctor or scientist or something is saying, well, I think we really need to do some more research before we publicize this recommendation. He's basically trying to be like a scientist about it, right? And the senator says, we don't have time for that.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got, he doesn't say it. He doesn't say it, but he doesn't say it. But what I would fill in is, I've got some big industries that are lobbying me to push their product here. With official government recommendations, right? And we don't have time to figure out what's really good for people.
that in concert with the fact that we live in a framework, and I remember Thomas Sowell said something along the lines of placing decision making in the hands of people who how did he phrase that quote about like the people who make policy, make political decisions, like, are never liable to face the consequences for them. And it's so true. It is absolutely so true.
Yep.
When have the political class or the credentialed class in any which way ever suffered a truly fitting consequence for being wrong? No, they just get re-elected, or they retire and receive a pension.
Yeah, we don't get to fire them when they do a bad job, right?
No, at least the Athenians could send their elites into exile. They could what's that? They used to do it in the assembly. They could ostracize their politicians, in exile for 10 years. Why can't we do that?
Give me just a sec. I'm messed up.
Can you hear me,
here.
Bradley?
Okay. I lost my AirPod and now everything's gone bonkers. Okay, give me just a sec here.
Hello, Bradley. Hello.
Okay. Sorry. my AirPod ran out of batteries, and then suddenly you sounded like full robot. I couldn't hear you at all, understand you at all. I'm seeing if that's for the folks too. Need to just quit this. Let's see. Is anything working?
Yeah, can you guys hear me in the chat? Because I'm still here. I actually can't hear Radlib though.
Okay, wait a second. Oh, bummer. Something is really bad. Okay, excuse me. I'm gonna be right back. I need to rejoin this. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm still here. I'm still here. Yeah, I still just can't hear Radlib though. I don't know what's happening. Radlib, if you can't hear me, I'll just message you on Twitter, DM. So I don't know what's actually going on. Radlib.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
You there, Radlib? Oh, okay, typing. Hello, Radlib?
Okay. Can you hear me, Furius?
Okay, yes, you're back.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Wow.
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, so that might be my steam-powered Australian internet just
Yeah, I don't know
itself.
what's going
Sorry
on.
about that.
Anyway, let's move towards
but
wrapping up,
the
I
longest
think,
period
because
then-
I've gotta pick up my kids
Yeah,
from
sure.
karate. So, I'm glad
sure
we got
thing.
to cover it near the end. You know, this, I don't know where you put this in your, spectrum from your professional money-making work over to your historical hobby, but somewhere in there is your interest in nutrition and health and the artificial nature of our current sort of state-enforced nutritional regime, which doesn't seem to be
Yeah.
to the good of our health, right? To be
Exactly.
to say the least.
Yeah, of course. That's quite right. And in the end, I just encourage I know I will admit that perhaps on some degree I can come across a bit of a zealot, but I think it's because I've seen so much of the lies and the deceit. It's something quite close to my heart in that regard. But I do encourage, because in the end, we're at the age now where a lot of us have families and have kids,
Yeah.
and as they have on so many other levels, politicians and credentialed people lie. And they lie because of vested interest, and they lie because of greed, and they lie because they have their own motivational factors for it. And yes, it's not great. Yes, it's appalling, but it is what it is. And in the end, we all have the ability to read the back of a packet and to make choices that are conducive with a healthy lifestyle and living well. And again, admitting to a bit of zealotry, but you know what? You also live, and you also got kids. Have a treat. Have a nice cake when your kids have a birthday. When it's a nice sunny day on the coast, buy an ice cream. You don't have to be a monk about this, but it's just finding a nice happy medium and realizing that, as they have on so many other levels, elites do lie to us, and they expect the peasants just to obey the proles. So that's
Right.
really sort of a bit of a closing message on that standpoint. And
Well,
the second thing I'll say is,
I would wait a
you
sec.
know-
I would say, Furious, that these last 2 years have shown us how much our health is really the true priority. To to
100%.
to say it very carefully.
Yeah, no, I understand. And notice also that the advice has been medical intervention, not, hey, keep yourself healthy and fit. And I
Right.
say this to absolutely anybody with parents or, I say grandparents, people approach the elderly years. I will preface this by saying that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an MD, I'm not a specialist, I'm not a physician, whatever, right? But from my observation and a lot of experience in the fields that I have done, with a lot of
exposure in the health and fitness industry, because I used to be obese and now I'm not, so I've done that journey myself. Is that vitality and exercise are good. Muscle and strength and endurance keeps you out of a wheelchair, and eating right and being sort of active mentally are the best things that will keep your brain from deteriorating. And if you at least get the basics right, you'll figure the rest out. But reading labels and trying to buy stuff that's as locally sourced as possible is the best. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, Radley, because it's kind of a shill. But when I was last on, not the one we just did with AA, but the other week, we did a cigar stream basically on the vegan, meatless, Impossible Burger sort of agenda and the vegan agenda. And we had a guy called Tristan on from a channel called Primal Edge Health. I would strongly recommend people go watch his material. I don't know if you call us friends, or at least acquaintances, but he had a journey that began with veganism, and now he owns a plot of land in Central America and runs his own sheep and goats and plants and grows his own stuff, and raises his own kids in a very healthy environment. And you can learn a lot from guys like that who have done it themselves. And I mean, I'm trying to get myself. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to get there myself. And we just have to go through this journey of learning stuff for ourselves and becoming equipped with knowledge, whereby we will not be prey to these vested interests.
Right. Yeah, I'm putting that in the live chat right now. I looked it up. The vegan stream from Academic Agents channel. People have been praising it. I got bits and pieces when it was live, but I haven't really listened through it. And I'm motivated to do that because everyone says that some serious good knowledge was laid down in that stream. So
oh yeah,
a great place to start, right?
Presentation was excellent. Farah's research was excellent, and Tristan brought a lot of knowledge to the table. I was actually almost the quietest party in that stream. So I was a very good company, and thanks to A for giving us the platform, because I think it's very important. When we talk about like the elites and global agendas and top-down driven stuff from from bureaucratic managerialism and the culture around that, the vegan meatless thing is such, like, it's not the main fulcrum of it, but it's definitely one of the major columns that is a part of their superstructure. Like, doubtless it is, and it ties into even our discussion today about agriculture writ large. These things overlap. Like, if you draw a Venn diagram, there'd be a ton of overlap.
Yeah, my sense is that the state enforced veganism we're just getting a little taste of what they really want to do. There's a lot more coming. We're at the beginning of that story, nowhere near the middle or the end. That's my view of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I respect the fact that you have to wrap up, Radley, but I just want to answer one question in the chat, if I may, because Fraser asked me what tractors I have. Dad, actually, my entire family, we've bought John Deere basically since the 70s, from when we started buying our new machinery, because when we first migrated to Australia, we had no money, so we just had to. My grandfather and my dad managed with what they had, but the first new machine that we ever bought was John Deere's, and we've only ever bought John Deere's. But I'm myself quite partial to a Fendt or a Fendt or a like the range that are offered by Fiat Iveco. They're quite nice brands, or like the Italian brands, because they're quite nicely designed tractors. Same is another example. But yeah, no, we've been a green family for as long as we've been in Australia. So I hope that answers your question, Fraser.
Yeah, we have a little bit of John Deere here as well, but not on the epic scale that a real farmer would have.
No, but congratulations on starting small, Bradley. It's very good that you've done that to your family, because it is truly the best life for your kids. And I mean, even for myself, like I don't have a family at the moment, but one of the reasons I'm returning to the land is that I hope to be in that situation myself, and I want to give my children the upbringing they can, because I mean, I don't want this to be a huge rallying call, but insofar the people are able, I would recommend, even if you don't go live on a plot of land, live in a country town. If you're able to get out of big cities, because they are not conducive to the human condition, and they are not a healthy place to be for your own psychology, and they are terrible places to raise a family. I'll just say that.
Yeah. When I mentioned, Furius, that we're looking at some additional acreage, one of the main motivations actually is that my wife, well, both of us grew up with horses. She worked at a stable when she was starting at age 13. And then my family owned a horse or two starting when I was like a teenager. So we just got our first equine, not a horse, but a pony, a month ago, to get us rolling. And then we hope
Very
to get
nice.
a horse that an adult can ride later this year.
Oh,
So,
that'd
you
be
know,
great. That'd be
we want to
beautiful.
get more land because we want to be able to give them a place to pasture and also a place where we can ride, you know.
Yeah,
But yeah,
and
so
just a quick, just
so
a quick tip, 'cause this comes from
gardening,
yeah,
riding, having fresh chicken eggs,
yeah,
selling our fresh duck eggs to the local Chinese people because they love the duck
nice,
eggs. You know,
yeah,
it's a little bit of dabbling, but it's fun, and my
hmm,
wife takes the lead on it while I sit at my desk
yeah.
all day doing my computer stuff. You know.
And the great thing with running ruminants, whether it's cattle, and I mean it does apply to horses as well, but if you actually run chickens alongside those kind of creatures, less so sheep and goats because they tend to poop out sort of pellets than patties, right? But
Hmm.
if you run ruminants and horses, if you run chickens alongside them, chickens actually feed because they've got a very acidic stomach. They actually feed on the pathogens that exist in horse and cow manure, like little larvae and worms and stuff that tend
Oh
to sort of
wow.
grow in and around the proximity. So essentially, if you run chickens alongside them, you will never ever have sort of worm-based parasites infect your livestock because the chickens will destroy it whilst nourishing themselves. Like
Wow.
that is true symbiotic and living in harmony with your soil as agriculture ought to.
Yeah, wow. I'll have to mention that. I'm sorry, I didn't mention we just got goats last year as well, so we have a few goats. So yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Don't
We
feed them
should
too much grass though, Radley, because grass to them is candy and they'll suffer gout. So make sure they eat brambles and thistles and bark, which is what a goat should be eating. Because if you
right.
observe a goat will always eat with its chin up. And if you
Yep.
observe a sheep or a cow or a horse, they'll always eat with the head down. So
Yep.
that's an evolutionary indicator they have different diets.
Yep. Yeah. Oh no, no. We know. We have
Okay.
lots of crap along the border of our land that we want them to we want the goats to
Oh,
knock out.
wonderful.
You know,
There you go.
honeysuckle.
Symbiosis. Beautiful.
Do you know about honeysuckle?
I don't know.
Okay, anyway, it's an invasive plant in our area, and there's way too
Uh-huh.
much of it on our land, and we want the goats to destroy it. And they're so good at it that people hire goats from other people to take out the
Yeah.
honeysuckle on their land.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
There
it's
you
good
go.
for the, and it's I understand it's a decent diet for them. It's not just happy for us
Absolutely.
to get rid of it. So anyway,
Yeah.
fun with farming on Radical Liberation this week. Okay, well, thanks very much, Furious. Furious does not, as far as I know, have a channel,
I don't
but
know. I'm just a
he is a
potential
frequent
guest.
he's a frequent guest on Apostolic Majesty's channel, and then he's been popping in other places like with Academic Agent and the Mr. Patriarch that I put in the live chat. So just keep your eye out for him. And then I've shared his Find My Friends, trying to start using that, Furious. I shared his Find My
Yes.
Friends, which for now just points to his Twitter. But you know, I figure if something else gets added to it someday, then I by pointing to that, then that automatically people see anything else. But yeah, you'll see Furious talk about nutrition issues. I think quite a bit on
Hmm.
Twitter, right, Furious?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
And just to mention too, I tend to stream sort of with a degree of frequency with Prudential as well, because we sort of cover, you know, like say with Apostolic, it's the history based and sort of like, you know, military, cultural, linguistic history that he does. But with Prudential, we sort of touch a bit more like on geopolitics and events
Ah,
as well. I
okay.
haven't been on his channel for a little while, but yeah, I do a fair bit with him too. So you know,
Oh,
I
good.
like going like, you know, we talk about different things, and just on that note, thank you for inviting me today. You know,
Yeah.
I know we both have this sort of latent interest. I mean, your background is finance and economy. For me, it's merely an interest, but it's actually quite nice to have touched on this. And I appreciate the invite. I've actually had a wonderful time. And you know,
Thank
if
you.
you fancy doing a sequel or touching on it again, it'd be my pleasure to come back. So thank you very
Yeah.
kindly for the invite,
Oh,
Radley.
and
And apologies to you in the chat today because I did get my time wrong. So I'm sorry for the half an
okay,
hour delay.
no problem. And worth mentioning that we just had Prudentialist on this channel for the first time 2 weeks ago, so 2 shows ago. So the audience has just met him quite recently, where we touched on some well, China in South America was the topic. So we got into some sort of geopolitics and economics of Chinese investment in South America and politics in South America. So that was kind of an amazing angle to come at, which I didn't expect for us to cover on this show. But that's what's fun about doing a show. You draw on the resources of your friends and everything. Okay, so thanks to Furius. Thanks everyone for joining us. Way more technical problems than usual. I have to say, generally, it's pretty smooth. I really have no complaints. Generally with my computer and OBS and YouTube, I don't know what all the pieces are that contributed today, but generally it all goes really nice. And today, man, I was struggling a bit, but I think we got through it.
It's Australia. It's Australia's fault. Don't worry about
that. Yeah, right.
Just blame Australia.
I think we got through it fairly well, and I hope this was of interest to everybody. And like I said in the marketing for the show, Furious, I feel like the Canadian truckers have been a nice reminder that we have people who actually physically are growing food, transporting food, keeping the electricity coming to our house so we can watch Netflix, right? Actually, this is something, by the way, that Jordan Peterson is really good on. He talks about, he'll emphasize that. He'll say, hey, everybody, you students sitting here in this nice air-conditioned room or heated room or whatever, listening to a lecture, this is happening because there's all these people out there doing, to some degree, risky and grueling work so that we can have this kind of existence, right? So anyway, I really appreciated having you on and hearing what your family's been doing for a while there in farming. And it's worth a reminder that this stuff doesn't just drop from the heavens. People have to actually figure out how to do it and make a profit at it and not get screwed over by the government too badly somehow. So anyway, thanks so much.
Indeed.
And bye, everybody. And next week, as I said, Ryan Turnipseed will get to drop in just before I get to meet him the very next day at the U.S. event, which still has a few spaces open. If you'd like to join us and meet us, it'd be a pleasure to. I like meeting people in real life whenever I can. I wish there wasn't all these restrictions the last 2 years. I wanted to go to the UK event and meet more friends over there. I've met Academic Agent in person at a conference, but haven't gotten to meet so many others. I prefer to meet people in real life when I can. Hopefully we'll get back to those days, right? I can have a little more freedom to travel.
Bradley.
Yeah, thank you.
Good luck with the thing as well. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it, and I hope it goes off without a hitch. So all the best to you guys. And thank you to the chat.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.